So it's April 28th, 2019, and I'm talking to writer, activist, journalist, let him tell it, Barrett Brown. Before we do that, I'm going to light my candle. Let's see if I can do that on camera. No, Barrett doesn't see this, but I got it. Oh, I killed it. I screwed up there. I have to do it again.
It's a bad omen.
It is. Well, there's not too many candles out there. So I'm waiting for the guest that's going to blow it out. So fuck you with the candle. What's with the candle routine? Anyway, candle's burning. Yeah, camera see that? There you go. Oh boy. Let's switch. There. That's Barrett Brown. Hello. Welcome.
Hello.
So you're talking to the Netherlands now. And you're in America, in Dallas, I take it.
Dallas, Texas. Yes, I'm afraid so.
Ah, how's that?
It's an odd place, even for the U.S., even for Texas. Dallas is in some ways backwards, and some of that has sort of come to affect me in the last few months in particular. I'm sure we'll get into that.
All right, cool. Yeah. So what I want to do in this conversation is talk through your past. I don't know, 10 years or so. You started off as a journalist, and your skill, your is writing. That's what you're good at. But you evolved, if you will, through activism. Ended up in jail. We're going to talk about that. Well, you're out of jail, obviously. Still on parole. Going to talk about that. And then how you look at press and reporting on stuff that's going on in your country and abroad. So, if that's okay with you, let's move back in time some 10 years or so. You're writing. That's your trade. And you, in my words, you figured, well, this isn't going anywhere. It's not fast enough or something. So how did that go? How did that process go for you?
Yeah. So I mean, when I started out as a writer, and when I was about 22, 20, when I first started selling articles to magazines and outlets when I was very young, I realized after they were published that I really hadn't accomplished anything. Even when I was writing about revealing instances of policy, things that clearly, theoretically, are the things that drive a republic, that keep a republic clean, fight corruption, impose transparency. But nothing was really accomplished. I figured later on, when I start writing for more prominent outlets, that's when I'll have an impact. And then I started writing for Vanity Fair and The Guardian, Huffington Post, and New York Press, and all these other deals. Did a book that was well received, and I still wasn't accomplishing anything. And a lot of journalists mostly don't either. And so Anonymous at the same time had been in my fallen into my perception. I'd been aware of it for a while, and I'd watched as it had started to take these first steps kind of accidentally into activism. And it occurred to me that, if these guys ever take themselves seriously, if these guys ever take these various techniques that they're applying to video game raids and all that kind of thing and apply it to politics, they'll be a geopolitical force. And I wrote a little bit about that. At the same time, I created my own little group, Project PM, which was intended to build a media, sort of reformed media network. And then when Anonymous began its Operation Tunisia, which was involved a number of Tunisian nationals who were also members, participants in Anonymous, working out of the Anonops IRC server, I was asked to come in and assist with that by Greg Hausch, an American who helps start the Scientology raids, and things went from there.
Yeah. So Project PM, in my words, was I'm selling it short probably, but an index, if you will, a way to find, a means to find your way through information, searchable also. So. Is that anything accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. So Project PM started out, we were trying to build and improve sort of information network just for all purposes, not for anything specific. And then later on, when this conflict arose between Anonymous on the one hand and these private intelligence agencies, these private companies that work with the U.S. government, work with the governments of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and France and the previous dictatorships of Tunisia and Egypt and all these, when that conflict arose and we started getting all of this information from stolen emails, I figured that Project PM should now become something entirely different, a crowdsourced research investigation into that subject, which the press was doing not a terribly great job of pursuing. And it was an index we compiled on a wiki that was called Echelon 2 back then. All the information that we had gleaned from these tens of thousands of stolen emails from one of the companies, conversations between that company and the NSA and the FBI and Palantir, some of the larger firms, and open source research into patents and all that. And we had a little chat room, and that was it. That's all we needed. And over the next year and a half while we were doing that, we incurred the wrath of the FBI and the DOJ because some of the things that we had focused on and kept in the news what was a really bizarre conspiracy that the DOJ, the Department of Justice in the U.S., had itself been involved with. And so when I was raided eventually by the FBI, those are the things that were listed on my search warrant first. Project PM, our website, HP Gary, one of those firms, another firm, In-Game Systems. That was what my case was all about.
Yeah, and you ended up in jail. So how long were you in jail for then?
I did 4 in prison. Originally, I was facing about 105 years worth of charges. The U.S., of course, is notoriously draconian. It's something of a police state and prison state already. And a lot of the charges were dropped. Some of them were very troubling to other journalists and researchers. For instance, I was facing 22 years early on. Mandatory minimum, as in 22 years minimum, no matter what, plus whatever else, on top of whatever else I got convicted for copying and pasting a link that had been posted into an anonymous chat server, the Anonop server, by the hacker Jeremy Hammond, and copying that link and pasting it into my own group, Project PM, our chat server, for the purposes of doing the same things I've been doing for a year, which is researching stolen emails and public information about these companies that we kept finding were committing crimes. As the transcript showed, and as the forensics showed, the government's own forensics showed, I was unaware when I copied and pasted the email or the link that it actually went to, in this case, information about this company Stratfor's customers, including their credit card information. That was clear to them from the beginning. It was also clear to them that the statute they charged me under was not appropriate to this. The statute involves identity theft. Government issued IDs. These were credit card numbers that I didn't even open to begin with. So those charges were eventually dropped. But between the time that those charges were made and the time they had to drop them, after we presented our motion to dismiss, about a 50-page document that the EFF assisted with, explaining why this was just bizarre, dangerous, outrageous. We did use this case to bring a lot of attention to how the DOJ works in general, how this campaign against whistleblowers is going, the links they're willing to go to make examples out of people. And of course, we had just seen Aaron Swartz overcharged as well for something like even more innocuous, even more clearly justified than a lot of things we were doing. That had happened, I think, a year prior to when these charges were dropped. And of course, Aaron Swartz, for those who don't know, killed himself when he was facing 20 years for making available research papers that the public had paid for, the U.S. taxpayers, but which they weren't allowed to see unless they paid again for them.
Yeah, so you've gone through the same thing. There's 2 questions that come to mind. One is, this was intentional, right? So the system threw everything on you and see something stick. So that was intentional. They knew a lot of wouldn't stick, but that was intimidation-wise what they would do. Same with Aaron Swartz. Correct?
Yeah, the case was extraordinarily was done in a way that was so bizarre and so clearly dishonest and so clearly retaliatory that it didn't take long for the press here and the press elsewhere and then press from organizations to notice and to realize that, hey, there's something wrong here. And because I was arrested initially by a SWAT team after having threatened back this FBI agent, I said I was going to investigate him using the same procedures that these private contractors that they were defending, that they were pursuing me over, had used against activists and journalists, or plotting to do so. Since my stance was that since these people who were ex-military, ex-intelligence, working with the DOJ, they're being listed in my search warrants because we're investigating them, and all this. These are leading to raids against my mother's house and against my apartment, and they're threatening to charge my mother. I'm going to use these same procedures against this FBI agent who's threatening to indict my mother. And so they decided to take that as a violent threat. They cut off part of the sentence. They added, really oddly, they added a statement that had been made on Fox News by this one guy who was talking about how we should murder Julian Assange. They put that quote and described it to me in my indictment because, of course, they knew that what they had, what I'd actually said, wasn't enough. But because of that, the long story short is that a lot of the press here, which sort of goes to one of my later points about the press in the U.S., they had no idea what was going on. They didn't know what this was about. A lot of things like Reuters, Dallas Morning News, my hometown paper, kept describing me as a hacker. And very few of them made mention of the fact that I was quite clearly a journalist. And almost none of them seemed to have been aware of the search warrant 6 months prior that had listed my journalistic activities as the real reason for all of this. Even though Michael Hastings, my old friend who died a few years ago, who was a U.S. journalist for Rolling Stone, even though he had posted that search warrant on BuzzFeed, one of the major outlets in this country. So the whole thing was just full of lessons for those who were interested in learning those lessons.
Yeah. Now, if I go back in your story to like 2010, when you decided to be more activistic, and I heard or read somewhere like you wanted to be more like an 18th century warrior in a way, not afraid.
I was always kind of eccentric, and I was always, since I was 13 years old, was very enchanted by the revolutionary tradition, by the Russian Jewish anarchists in the U.S. like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, who were, Emma Goldman, for great example, she fought the U.S. on some things when they were engaging in oppression, and then when she was exiled of the Soviet Union in the early days of about 1920, 1921 there, she immediately saw what was wrong with it, and then she attacked that too. There was nothing that she wouldn't attack and turn on a dime if she thought it was doing something wrong. And that's the model that I think more people need to be following today. But at any rate, yes, I was very fond of Bonapartism, the French Revolution, that sort of thing, and I wanted to try to revive those things, even in this very drudgerish, sort of sordid postmodern age where no one really believes in much.
Exactly. Okay, so I wanted to lay that down, and that describes you properly. Now the question is, because you brought up Aaron Swartz, who ended up killing himself. Can you relate to what does it do to you when the system attacks you on that scale?
There's a couple of different sort of levels on which it affects you, and one of it, even for someone like me who was essentially a very militant anti-government figure for a long time, even so, you still kind of feel betrayed when you see the DOJ and FBI doing these things, that they know they're lying. For reasons I suppose I can understand. I understand like the national security mindset. I understand what that is. It's not a mystery. But using methods that, some of these people that we deal with as activists when we go up against the U.S. government and end up in the justice system, they're people that really that surprise us. People who do things that the average person you're going to deal with as a reasonable human being will not do. It's a really shocking experience to go through, no matter what you've been through prior. And you never lose that sense that you've been betrayed, not just by your country, but by your countrymen. And that was compounded in my experience by seeing my fellow journalists also betray me early on. But before it became a cause célèbre, before it became popular and to support me, when it all became clear what this is about, some astonishing things were written about me, including by publications that I've written for previously, and which neglected to note that I used to write for them.
So you ended up doing some 4 years.
Yes.
So some charges were dropped, but did you plea, or how did you get out within only 4 years?
So they made me a series of offers. So I was facing 105 years back at the end of 2012, very late 2012. They came to me from my first lawyer with an offer. They said, we're not going to give him any kind of deal, any kind of plea bargain unless he agrees to cooperate. So I told him, no, I'm not going to do that. And that was supposedly their one offer. Then a few months later, they had their next final offer, and that was that they wanted me to plead to one of the counts of the 11 counts I had been given of that linking charge. And if I did that, I would just have basically probably 2 or 3 years. I would have already done 1.5. I'd be out pretty soon, maybe out just then. I refused that as well on the grounds that to agree to that, to plead to anything involving linking, or anything that betrayed me as engaging in fraud or theft, which is something that I don't do. That would endanger other journalists and other researchers, and that was something that was recognized pretty widely back then as well. That would set a precedent, give them a tool set by which to go after others, and there was no way I was going to hand them that victory. Beyond that, I mean, that makes me sound more brave than I am. I also had a pretty good idea that these charges didn't make sense and were not tenable. And so if I could just hold out and meanwhile work with the press on the outside through my people and explain to them, show them things, make it clear to them what this is really about, I could gradually bring pressure on the DOJ, help to discredit it, and win some sort of victory for us. For those of us who were, like me, in prison already, facing prison, had sacrificed for this, and that's obviously part of what you do as a militant revolutionary. You look for victories in propaganda, even if you're doing it from prison, even if you're losing in the other sense.
Well, one of the things that you did manage to do in 2015, you were writing for The Intercept back then, and you won a National Magazine Award from prison, if I take it, if I'm correct.
In fact, I was being held in not a solitary cell, but a segregation cell, a 23-hour, 24-hour day lockdown cell. Both when I was writing the articles that won that award and a few others, and also when the award was actually won. So I was sitting there in the shoe, being held on an investigation that was kind of a phony thing because I'd done an interview. And at the same time, my editor with The Intercept was accepting my award, and then I got out of the shoe and was informed by by the unit commander, the guards, like, "Oh, congratulations, you won the National Magazine Award." So that was I guess unique in the history of American journalism.
that was. Well, the reason I'm bringing that up also is just last week you burnt that thing. So
I did.
Yeah, we'll get to that at the end of the talk. But we're in 2015 now. You got out of jail in 2016 on probation, which is about to end, right? So.
Yes, I was given 2 years probation, and that ends next month. So I've been able to travel outside of the Dallas area with permission if I'm going to go speak at a university or a conference. I did this week. This week I spoke to a conference of librarians in the state of Tennessee. This is the sort of thing I didn't get to do back before I was a felon. I had to go to prison for 4 years to be respectable enough to address librarians, universities. So that all worked out for me rather oddly.
Well, you can't change anything, but even if you could, but do you look back? Is there regret, or is there whatever, it turned out like this, or how do you? I mean,
overall, I'm sometimes even frightened at the idea that it might not have turned out like this. That I might have missed the boat at some point, not got involved in Anonymous, did this. I mean, it was all worth it. There are tons of regrets though in terms of chances we screwed up. Some of us, those of us who were involved in Anonymous, or obviously people involved in WikiLeaks, there was a lot of not just missed chances, but just misbehavior. I mean, there was misconduct. There's things I look back on because a lot of what I did was recorded, was logged in various ways. I look back at some of me and some of these other guys of like chortling, mocking our enemies, that we've beaten, and just enjoying it too much. And it kind of, I don't like to look at some of that stuff. It makes me, I was a much sillier person then, and I think a person who was less serious about what he was doing than I try to be now. I think that I needed to go to prison and to have that in front of me, that possibility of life in prison, which I had really in a very real way for a while, to get more perspective and to sort of become a better person than I was back then, and that a lot of us were back then. So that's one thing I am thankful for.
Also, in one of your interviews, you mentioned we wouldn't be doing this if we enjoyed life more. So how's life? There's always
the idea that there's some people who become revolutionaries. They do so because there's something missing in their life. For me, it's something I do either way. I mean, I've had kinds of depression, addiction issues, but it's something that I really do. I really am fond of. It really does. It really is what I like to do. I also like to write, of course, but for me, being able to risk and sort of engage in some kind of combat with powerful institutions, that are doing something wrong. That's my hobby. It's what I like to do. I don't like to watch sports. I don't like television. It's just I like to cause trouble, and that's just how I am.
All right. Well, I don't know. That's not the goal, right? Cause trouble, is it?
Well, it depends on what you mean by trouble. I mean, in the English, that idiom, it has oftentimes a positive connotation in the U.S. in particular. I mean, trouble is generally how things get back on the right keel.
Yeah.
In this sense, I mean, you have a status quo, you have an orderly setup where you have companies engaging in whatever crimes they want to engage in against journalists and activists, and doing it.
Yeah, you have no problem at all in shaking that thing up. That's what you
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. When something is that bad, as long as you do it responsibly and you're not just saying, let's just burn it all down, let's screw everything up, as I think some people started to do in this movement at some point. Yeah. As long as you're not doing that and you're keeping focus and you're keeping in mind that it's not necessarily about your own feelings or your desire for revenge, that it's always has to be, in support of some moral, ethical, articulatable cause, then to that extent, burn it down, shake it up.
Okay, well, I like shaking up. That's cool. So somewhere along that path, you came up with something that's now called pursuance. So
yes.
How did that start?
So pursuance it's a more refined version of the really early efforts that myself and Michael Hastings, a journalist who I met in 2009 and sort of became close colleagues with, because we both despised a lot of what we saw in the press. It's a renewed attempt based on the experience we now have over the past 10 years and seeing how these things work, to build what I originally wanted which was a civic network. Or actually, originally I wanted a media sort of a new kind of media distribution network, but that also evolved very quickly into a civic network when we started getting volunteers who weren't in the press. It's something that is now more fleshed out and more better articulated. And I have a nonprofit that I started upon getting out of prison. We have a lot of interesting board members and participants, like Brigitte Jansdottir, who of course was the Icelandic member of parliament, head of the Pirate Party over there. Yeah. Also early WikiLeaks volunteer. We have, in fact, Naomi Colvin, who also just defected sort of from the WikiLeaks sphere last year when Assange demanded that she cut me off as a beneficiary of his Courage Foundation because he was upset with me for criticizing him. Then she joined our group, and she's still involved in trying to defend his rights. But we pick up a lot of great people from WikiLeaks as they deteriorate, which is always nice. Number of other individuals who were admired whistleblowers, John Kiriakou, who exposed the U.S. torture program. And we're going to be establishing this, what we call process democracy. It's a self-organizing, a more democratic version of democracy by which to govern activist initiatives, by which, things like press reform campaigns, information operations, crowdsourced research. This is something that it's sort of hard to explain here, but we have some diagrams and speeches and on YouTube and all that go into it more. But the short version is that this is something that is going to take the agility, the speed with which a movement can operate, a movement like Occupy Wall Street or Anonymous or Project PM or whatever, and give it an exoskeleton. Give this jellyfish, this mobile jellyfish, an exoskeleton so they can grow with it, but they can hold its structure, protect it, ensure that it doesn't just turn into some random thing, as Anonymous, of course, was inevitably going to do, and as it recently has in the last few years. Something that can grow perpetually and eventually start challenging institutions in ways that I think people will be astonished as it happens.
Yeah. So, I'll put some links in under this clip of videos where people can watch what you did over the years. Accidental Warriors, a documentary, live in time with Barrett Brown, that's going to be in there. And I saw another one, Circle of Hope. There's an interview that you did with Spencer Ackerman. And in that thing, you said, well, currently if you want to organize in some way, there's either Facebook or nothing. So in walks
Right.
pursuance. So that would
And among the people who are very much waiting for this are like when I got anonymous, it was because of this thrust, this fight for Arab democracy in Tunisia in particular, which was actually very successful. And that was something I kept working on via Bahrain and some other things. And there's a lot of Arab reformers in particular who, just like around the world, people are using Facebook because they have to make a decision between, do I use something highly secure with the people I know, like Signal, or do I, on Facebook and reach the people that are out there? And they have to make that decision. And it's a decision that brings with it risks of getting themselves arrested and tortured, as some of our friends in Tunisia has happened to them early on, getting others arrested, killed. That's a tough decision to have to make, and we don't want them to have to make it much longer. This doesn't mean that we're going to be able to replace things like Twitter and Facebook in terms of reaching large numbers of people. Pursuance is not intended to be a mass social network in that sense with millions and millions, but it will provide a sort of base of operations, a much more refined and customizable and formidable mechanism for taking on serious activism and journalism work than what currently exists.
All right. Now you mentioned Brigitte Jonsdottir from Iceland. Now, when I started being somewhat more activistic, I decided, well, if the power is in government, let's try get there, right? Change the system from where power is. Oh, well, we failed. We didn't get elected, but she did. Now, the question is, how would you describe politicians, and is there any hope in those guys changing the system, and is there any hope in making a move to government, or do we need to just let government be and go around that?
I think a multi-front strategy is the only morally appropriate strategy. I think to abstain from any existing process, so long as you're doing it morally, one should never abstain from that kind of thing. Politics exists, our governments exist, nation states exist, and so long as they exist, we can't just leave the field, leave a vacuum. We have to do what we can within those systems while we also build, let's say, a scaffolding around the building of states. Reform it from the outside and from the inside when possible. So to that end, one of our big initiatives we'll be pushing for under this pursuance system and under something called the Process Congress, which we've kind of been announcing gradually over the last few days, in which Brigitte Jonsdottir is one of our first participants. We'll be doing all these other usual things, but we'll also be involved here and there in politics. One of the things I'm doing here in the U.S. now is providing to candidates in local elections and state elections that we find to be, worthwhile, providing them free services of the sort they usually have to pay like some scummy local, political fixer for, opposition research, that kind of thing. We can do that on a crowdsourced basis using volunteers. We can turn it into a civic activity, an open, transparent activity intended to clean up this government, which we have a lot of cleaning to do. And so here in Dallas, this is kind of where we're starting. We have a fellow we have two city councilmen, one of whom is running for mayor this week and may very well make it. But at any rate, we have a base here with a lot of interesting people, a lot of people who want transparency. And we have a city that the closer you look at it, the closer you look at the newspaper, the closer you look at the mayor and the city government and the police, you see a city in need of fixing. And that's the kind of thing we always like to start with. Yeah. We always have to start with the biggest problems, move on to the small problems later. And so we have some interesting things in the works, to address those things. But more to the point, this mechanism is intended to ensure that all of the people out there who have these great ideas, who have, whether or not they have an institutional background, even a college degree, which I didn't, and they may not be the kind of person who works well in an institution. We want their ideas to be harnessed. We want to give them a chance to rise and put these things to use and become leaders in their own right. And for those who don't want leaders, for those who prefer to work in more distributed, sort of even structures, these are like a set of Tinker toys. You can use this system within this little universe we'll be setting up online to build up networks however anyone wants it, and who wants to work in a certain kind of network that's very top down can do so. Yeah. Anyone who wants to start a network that can do so. No one involved will ever have to say, well, I didn't sign on for this, or I don't approve of that. It's not a majority vote kind of thing. It's democracy by association. And I think this sort of thing is our best chance forward if we're going to encourage mass citizenship, and also take full advantage of it.
All right, cool. So that was politics, and that was activists. Now, one of the checks and balances that we have as society is also press, freedom of the press. Let's move to that then. So you started as a journalist way back. You still are. You write. So how would you describe how's press freedom changed, and how's the press changed over the last 10 years?
I think it's hard for me to say, because I have a better sense of it now in the last 10 years than I did the prior 10 years, because aside from having been a journalist for a while and having been a media critic who focused very much on how the media works and why it sometimes doesn't work, I've since, in the last, let's say, 8 years, I've been covered by the press as well. So, and quite a bit, because of the case and all the anonymous stuff and whatever. And when you were covered by the press, you have a very unique opportunity to see how accurate it is, because you're talking about things you were involved in, that you're an expert on. And sometimes you can document those things. In my case, the FBI did a great job of documenting every step I made for a couple of years. So it's a unique opportunity to both figure out how things go wrong and how often they go wrong, and also to display those things, to compile them. And the book that that just finished the manuscript for, that's coming out early next year for one of the U.S.'s larger publishers. Much of it, obviously a lot of it's about anonymous. Some of it's about some of the intelligence contracting things, the surveillance, data mining, propaganda. A lot of the techniques that even journalists still don't know much about, even though we've tried for quite a while to bring it to their attention. It's really mostly about information and the press, and how the enemy, how criminalized institutions are taking advantage of the press's deficits, and how we can fix those deficits and build our own structures.
Who is the enemy then? Who are we fighting? How would you define that?
The enemy is always, throughout history, it's always those individuals who do not respect the rights of other individuals, the dignity of others, as well as those who may be inherently good when it's easy to be good. But when it's not easy or even slightly inconvenient, they'll happily coalesce with the bad. Specifically, right now, it's the major nation states. It's China, Russia, the U.S. It is, just to lesser extents, some of the Western European nations, particularly the Anglosphere, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, UK, U.S. These are nations that have the more we learn about what they've been doing, and the more we think about the reality of what they've done in the open, in Vietnam, the Gulf, Middle East, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that these are governments that ultimately need to be brought to heel, and that the English-speaking world and our leaders have to start suffering consequences for their actions. And so that's something that doesn't come quickly. It's something that takes a lot of preparation. It takes moral arguments being made in different ways. And part of it does take drowning out the stuff that these populations have been hearing for 20, 30 years on CNN and NBC, and for the people who generally agree with everything Henry Kissinger does, or at any rate thinks Henry Kissinger is a fine person, but that I should go to prison for 100 years. That conversation needs to be changed, along with anything else we might try to do. And having said that, the kind of things that I think are going to be most compelling and effective in the next 20, 30 years won't necessarily require first getting a majority of a citizenry to understand it. A lot of these things, as usual throughout history, involves a vanguard of very committed individuals who are morally compelled to act, and who, in this case, will act within their own rights. Just developing new techniques for obtaining information, using it, making these cases, and oftentimes, I suppose, imposing transparency and imposing, getting institutions that are currently overstepping their bounds and interfering with the rights of others and committing murder, libel, creating massive police states, redirecting the violence, redirecting the negativity back to the people who deserve it, rather than, say, Arab children in Yemen, who are the people that we traditionally kill.
Yeah. All right. So, but do you see the press reporting on this or getting better, or do you see new? How's that going?
I would say, because I know you asked me this earlier. So I think starting in about 2004, I think a lot of people, like Jon Stewart, who was a great, big figure in the U.S., who was, at the Daily Show, that comedy news channel. He went on CNN, one of CNN shows, and he just sat there and started lecturing about their debates and the way in which their bid for ratings was really harming the U.S. by breaking down policy. If you go and look at Time magazine in the U.S. from the early 60s and read and just look through it, or just flip through it, you'll immediately sense that things have deteriorated, at least in the last 40, 50 years. Yeah. You'll notice, where are all the huge 2-page photo spreads? Why is it more than 20 pages? Why are there little boxes with paragraphs? This is about, this was a more intellectually rigorous age, for better or worse. And of course, the U.S. and the West has improved in many ways, but in terms of serious consideration to policy, we've been, it's a citizenry's fault. I don't want to blame it on a certain sector, but the press has allowed itself to go along with it and justified the things that it does in terms of dumbing down the country, dumbing down our conversations. And in some ways, in the last 10 years, in ways that I'm just beginning to understand now that I've gone back and been able to look at some of the things I've forgotten about or missed. A lot of the opportunities that were created by activists and leakers and whistleblowers in terms of discovering the nature of some of these companies that now deal in information, work with the U.S. government, things like Palantir, those opportunities were drowned by small numbers of journalists who were careerists, who had no interest in these things, and who have since gone on to write for the most prestigious outlets, but whom we can show pretty readily, and I have. That was one of the reasons I burned that National Magazine Award, that they were the ones who basically allowed the 2016 election in the U.S. and the Brexit election in England to be manipulated as they were by Cambridge Analytica and some of the firms that we'd identified way back then while they were spitting on us.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to that award burning ceremony in like 2 minutes. So, but there's hope also. I mean, 10 years ago, I didn't know anything. And then you had, I learned up on Thomas Drake, who went through the official channels, right? Being a whistleblower through the official laid out channels. And he said not too long ago, well, I don't know if that road is still open. If somebody wants to expose something now, I wouldn't do it per se now the way I did it back then. And then we had Chelsea Manning, who went through WikiLeaks, and Ed Snowden, who went public with Glenn Greenwald. Now that hooks into you burning that award, because that information is out there, and it's needs to be safeguarded still. Now, what's going on with that award, and why did you burn it?
So I'm extraordinarily Puritan when it comes to the press and when it comes to say national dialogue. I feel like the press has a extraordinary responsibility. It's a central nervous system, and in the U.S., it's the central nervous system of a unprecedentedly complex and massive imperial republic, the likes of which no one could have imagined 100 years ago, and in some cases 30 or 40 years ago, in some aspects. So when I see them fail, and when I see them fail to take responsibility for their failures, it upsets me, and particularly in this case where a lot of my friends have died or are still in prison for the things we were trying to do. So the last straw for me, for The Intercept, which I quit in 2017 for some of these reasons I explained then, was when they closed the Snowden archive down a month and then put out an explanation for it that just did not jibe with what I knew to be the case. And so first I leaked a number of internal documents, emails, and some things written by Laura Poitras, who was one of the co-founders of The Intercept. And in fact, she was the one who first recognized the value of what Snowden has after Glenn Greenwald had kind of brushed him off. She presented an account of events that, and some questions she had asked those who made this decision to close the archive and didn't get answers to. And so I published a lot of that. I wrote an email to every single executive and staffer at The Intercept explaining this sort of secret history of Greenwald and some of the editors there who had Greenwald was one of the first people I warned about Ramos Coin, about Archimedes. Palantir should have been fully aware of because that was one of the companies that was going after him, which Anonymous foiled this plot in 2011. It was a major news story, but he lost interest in those things very quickly when it was no longer about him. And so a month after I was raided by the FBI, I was raided in March 2012. A month later, I wrote another article for The Guardian, going over all these things again. I sent it to Glenn Greenwald, and I said, look, the public needs to understand some of these things that we've uncovered. They need to understand persona management, which involves the proliferation of fake online people for intelligence purposes, and which the U.S. Air Force have been caught doing, and which is being done. We now know quite a bit more, just as we expected it would be. And I told him, please bring attention to this kind of thing and these other things I told you about. I'm going to have a hard time haranguing people about these issues when I'm in prison. And he had happily used our research that we composed on Palantir in the days after it was revealed that they had targeted him. All that didn't respond to that email. And despite having promised me he would write about this other situation where a USA Today reporter was being targeted by some of the same kind of companies that were going after him, I've come to realize just in the last couple of weeks when I went back and looked, he never did write about that. So that's a story that's kind of replicated over and over again in this history. And it's just one of the reasons why I don't think that Greenwald and these other editors and this CEO of First Look Media, which owns The Intercept, I don't think they were the ones. I don't think they were competent to make this decision that there's no good reason to maintain the Snowden archive there. They've already shown themselves to be incapable of recognizing clearly massively relevant, massively dangerous elements and just ignoring them. And I think that's something that if you do that as a journalist or anyone, I think you owe it to the civics. I think you owe it to your fellow citizens and frankly the whole world to stop and say, hey, maybe I'm not as clever as I thought I was. Maybe it was wrong of me to,
Yeah, but with all
here,
with all the pressure that's been on you and what we see now with an example being made out of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, who's in jail again, I mean, there must be pressure on organizations like The Intercept as well. So wouldn't that be more of a factor than incompetence?
It's possible, but that's not what Greenwald is putting out in his statements. They talked about budget restrictions, reorganizing for the future. He noted that some other outlets like the Washington Post, they have portions of the Snowden archive, and they're no longer reporting on it, and use that as one reason. Now, the day that when Greenwald or anyone else that I've taken a bullet for, in a sense, starts talking about how we're not going to report on something because the other outlets aren't going to report on it. That's a sad day. Greenwald's a huge press critic, rightfully so. Yeah. And he knows perfectly well that it doesn't matter what the Washington Post and New York Times think is relevant. They also missed the same stuff he missed back then when I gave it to them. And so it's possible that there's some other considerations here. In fact, it's actually very possible that there's more afoot than is publicly known, and that might become more evident soon. But regardless, it means that they're lying to the public. As a news outlet that pays its top people $500,000 a year and takes in donations, and did so largely on the strength of the fact that it was the outlet that was reporting heavily on these Snowden documents.
Yeah. All right. Now, if do you see the amount of people that come forward and do stuff, either whistleblowing or reporting or being critical or starting podcasts like this little thingy here, is that increasing? How's your view on that?
Certainly. And like, as I started to say earlier, and I kind of got off to another subject, I mean, some people in the press are more aware of some of the problems in the press than they were 10, 15 years ago, and that's increasing. And we do have a lot more independent outlets. But absolutely, there are people that have been taking advantage of the fact that the internet now exists, taking advantage of the fact that we can get around these structures that have always seemed so massive and develop things that either do a little bit of good here and there or might inspire some people to act. Or sometimes, prove to be the next, big solution and gets replicated or grows itself. I mean, WikiLeaks is a great example. You can do that. That was one of the inspiring elements, of 10 years ago. It's one of the things that got me excited about the idea of figuring out, what other mechanisms can we create that are going to change geopolitics for the better. And of course, WikiLeaks, from my standpoint, essentially went bad, abandoned its mission a few years. I guess around the time I was in prison, as far as I can tell. And that's not, I don't mean to say that Julian Assange should have been a perfect person, or that, we should expect someone who's in that position, someone who's attacked and lied about and persecuted by the Pentagon from the very beginning, when he was doing things that I don't think anyone could object to, who's not a fascist, revealing information about Kenyan election theft, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. They were going after the things he did right and not, early on, and not for the things he did wrong later on. Yeah. And that was always the case. And so I've criticized Julian Assange for about 2 years now, pretty regularly, ever since some things came out. And having spoken to some of the people who've been close to him in last years and have since left, I've learned enough that I'm quite comfortable criticizing him, whatever. But at the same time, his rights have to be defended. And at the same time, we have to remember that that model of WikiLeaks and the things that were done, that model cannot be allowed to be discredited. That model has to persist and it has to be expanded upon. We need better models that don't allow a single megalomaniacal person to start doing his own, global foreign policy behind the scenes. We need things that don't allow for that kind of leadership to arise. But we do need to follow that broad model of one individual can step up, create something, and challenge the world's criminal institutions. Institutions that I should note are vastly worse than anything Assange could hope to do ever.
Yeah, and protect freedom of press, freedom of expression, regardless of personal flaws or whatever. So,
absolutely,
you're not all that free just yet. I mean, there's probation. You can move, but it's somewhat restricted. That ends in a month. Where you want to go? In
a month I'll be off probation. I will no longer be subject to any particular. I still am a second-class citizen. I can't vote in the U.S., which is fine. I can vote by other means. But yes, I'll be free to leave the U.S. for the first time in I guess 8 years, almost. And I do plan to take advantage of that fairly soon. So because it's gotten too difficult to work here. I still want to be involved very heavily in U.S. politics and even regional politics in Dallas and all that. I still have a lot I want to do, but I can do it. If I can write from the Intercept from a 6x9 cell where I'm locked into for 2 months, I can do a lot of stuff, using the internet from wherever I am.
So, any travel plans that you want to elaborate on already?
I've already said pretty publicly that I like the idea of going to Iceland. I'm fond of some of the things I've seen about Germany are impressive. The fact that I think about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a prosecutor who was supposedly about to pursue charges against these guys who ran a news website and published some secret documents. And this prosecutor was planning on charging him. And people took to the streets in Berlin. And a few days later, that prosecutor was out. That's the exact opposite of this country. And it's wonderful to hear about. I understand, none of these countries are perfect, but it'll be interesting to live in a civilized country for once in my life.
For a while,
anyway. I managed to do that.
Barrett Brown, thank you. So, anything in closing that you want to share or?
Yeah, sure. Pursuanceproject.org. You can go there and sign up, learn a little bit more about Pursuance, see some of the articles that have been written about what this will be, how it will work, and sign up to be notified when we launch. And pretty soon I'll be announcing some more things about the Process Congress and what it is. As well as one of its first initiatives, which will be an effort to build our own press structures and to provide those journalists who want them with crowdsourced research networks of the same sort that we used so effectively that the FBI came after us back in the day. Make those available to them, and those journalists who want to improve can do so, and those journalists who don't, we use those same networks to audit their work and show all the errors. But we need to address information communications first. Before we can make any progress fundamentally on anything else. I think the last 10 years is living proof of that. We've had too many things squandered, too many sacrifices just dismissed and spit on by some people who are been very successful in the press. And until we can change that, everyone's issue, whether it be global climate change, anti-corruption, transparency, immigrants' rights, whatever it is, your issue, your cause, and your efforts will be attacked in the background by these intelligence contracting firms and by governments. And they'll be misrepresented in many cases by journalists who don't consider themselves to be accountable. And too much will be squandered unless we're able to give the press its first major reform since the 17th century, when the editor-writer model was invented in London, and which hasn't changed since. It's time. We're overdue for that kind of reform. So I hope people will participate in that.
Yeah, let's do that. Barrett, thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you very much for having me.